Hello everyone, this is our first video lecture on Chapter 1, The History of Psychology, and I put this phrenology head from the 1800s on here to just sort of talk a little bit about how people have always been fascinated by the mind and how the mind works and why it is that we're all so different. So psychology is really the study of the mind, and the people back in the 1800s really had no idea and no ability to understand how the brain works or really understand. I don't know where they got their ideas about cautiousness being here or identity being here, but they were really trying to understand how the mind works. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about the history of psychology. We're going to talk about some of the major debates in psychology and some of the major figures in psychology. And we're going to go through it pretty quickly. We will talk in depth about many of the more famous and more important theorists in psychology. But some of the major debates in psychology talk about what makes us who we are. Is it nature? Is it stuff that we're born with? Or is it nurture, our environment, what we grow up with? How much of who we are is some conscious? Are we consciously aware of? And how much is going on in our mind that we're not consciously aware of? Freud, who we'll talk about here in a bit, felt like only the tip of the iceberg was conscious, and the majority of our mind was actually unconscious. And our mind definitely works without us knowing it sometimes. If you've ever been driving and had that sensation that, you need somebody's going to hit you or something, and it was accurate, that was your mind putting together information that you weren't even paying attention to. If you're able to text with your thumbs on your phone, you don't need to look at the letters. You unconsciously know where everything is at. So definitely we have a lot of unconscious processes, and how much that unconscious mind impacts us is something that Freud talks about as well. And then free will versus determinism. So determinism is that we're completely determined by what we're born with and by our environment, and we don't have any choice about it. Whereas other psychologists would say we have free will, we can choose, we could change our personality. And most psychologists would probably say that all of these are important factors in determining who we are. We're very complex as human beings, and we're a complex mix of all of these things. So our genetics, what we're born with, what we grow up with, things that happen to us during childhood, and our individual choices as well. So the first psychologist was actually Wilhelm Wundt. He was a German psychologist. He was the first person to actually be called a psychologist. And he actually established the first psychology research laboratory in 1879. Psychology is a relatively young science. Um, but we have really made a lot of strides and have a really good understanding of the brain, but there's still a lot of information, still a lot of mysteries to be sorted out and figured out. So Wilhelm Wundt started this psychology lab, and he was really trying to understand our thought processes and how our mind actually worked. He wanted to separate psychology from philosophy, because prior to this, psychology had been considered a kind of philosophical. It wasn't really a real science according to a scientist. So he really wanted to prove that psychology could be a valid science. So what he did in his laboratory is he showed patients different objects and had them think about their thoughts about them and record their thoughts about this particular object. And he called that introspection. So thinking about your own thoughts is introspection. So he was really hoping to kind of categorize thoughts and understand thoughts better through this process. And unfortunately, his research wasn't very successful, but he really did start a movement in psychology to make it more scientifically based. His theory was also called structuralism, where it was really trying to understand the basic components of thoughts and consciousness. So after Wilhelm Wundt, William James came along, and he was the first American psychologist. His theory was called functionalism. And James was really influenced by Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, and he really wanted to understand how our mind functions and how it helps us to adapt to our environment. And he wanted to understand the purpose of our thoughts and our emotions and our behaviors. And he was really looking at the whole mind rather than just the thoughts that Wilhelm Wundt was looking at. After James, Sigmund Freud came along, and he often people think of Sigmund Freud as the father of psychology. Um, but Wilhelm Wundt is actually the father of psychology, but he really is the father of psychoanalysis and also the first to actually start counseling and sit down and actually talk to patients and try to understand people psychologically through talking to them. But Sigmund Freud was actually a medical doctor. He was a neurologist in Vienna, Austria. This is a picture of his office in Vienna, Austria. And he had many patients that came into him, women patients primarily. I can't think of any history of male patients, any studies on male patients. But these women would come into his office and explain that they couldn't, their arm was paralyzed, or they couldn't feel their hand, and he would examine them, and there was nothing physically wrong with them, and he started to think that maybe there was something psychologically going on, and so he thought, well, I'll sit down and talk with them and see if we can figure out what's going on. Hysteria and neurosis are kind of old terms that are still used a little bit, but not as much. And hysteria doesn't mean what you think it means. Hysteria is actually where your psychological symptoms are causing your psychological problems are causing you to have physical symptoms. So this is what Freud was treating most of these female patients for, was what he called hysteria. Neurosis is really anxiety as we know it today. So Freud created psychoanalysis, which is the first talk therapy. And he was a contemporary of Mesmer who was doing hypnosis. And he did try out hypnosis, but he didn't feel that it was successful. But what he would do is he would have these women come into his office and lay down on this couch, which seems a little strange. And he would sit in this little green chair, and he would ask them to free associate and just talk about whatever came to their mind. And patients would spend hours in psychoanalysis. Just talking about things that were going on in their day to day. Freud is often criticized because a lot of his theories are pretty highly sexualized. And if you think about it, when he was practicing 1890s, 1900s, the society was pretty sexually repressed. People didn't talk about sexuality. So he was very controversial at his time, and he's still pretty controversial today. There is a theory that possibly many of these women that came in with symptoms may have been victims of sexual abuse and may have shared stories of abuse, and they may have shared it as a dream, or I don't think a fantasy, but he didn't necessarily understand that maybe it was a real thing, and maybe he did, I don't know, but I think the women may have presented it as a dream because that was a safer way to present it. So that may be one of the reasons why his theories are a little bit sexualized. But he had made some really important contributions to psychology and to counseling. He was the first to suggest that childhood events affect adulthood, which to us seems obvious. But in his time frame, if you were wealthy, you sent your kid off to boarding school when they were 6 years old and didn't see them for the year. And people just didn't have this understanding that childhood was really important in development of people and human beings. So we understand that much better today. He also came up with the idea that we have an unconscious mind that affects our emotions and behaviors. And so he felt that things that maybe happened to you in childhood could unconsciously affect you in adulthood. And part of his idea in therapy was to uncover these things that happen and understand the unconscious impact of that. He also came up with this idea of the id and the ego and the superego, and you guys probably have heard this places, I don't know, and it seems a little silly in the way sometimes it's presented, but truly, if you think about it, we all have sort of a battle between good and evil in our minds. We're always trying to balance societal expectations or parents' expectations and just having a good time. So Freud would say that the id was our primal instincts and urges and just wanting to have a good time. Our superego is kind of our parents and society and, the right thing to do. And then we're the ego in the middle, and we're sort of, battling between the two, trying to make the right choice. But Freud kind of had this sort of negative view of human nature. He sort of felt we were innately bad, and that the reason why we had psychological problems and anxiety is because we were having trouble keeping these primal urges under control. Um, and another criticism of Freud is that it's just based on case studies. So he would just intensively study individual patients, and there's no way to really scientifically study his research or test his research. But is still really important contributor to the field of psychology. And we will definitely talk more about Freud in the chapters on development and on personality. So the next movement in psychology is behaviorism. And the behaviorists were really critical of Freud in the sense that they felt like we shouldn't be studying thoughts and things that, aren't scientific. They said that we should only study things like behaviors that we can see and that we can actually measure. They weren't concerned about our inner experiences or our inner thoughts because they said we can't scientifically measure that. So the behaviorists, and especially the radical behaviorists, believed in environmental determinism, that we're 100% determined by our environment. John Watson was known as a radical behaviorist. He was also known as the father of behaviorism. And he famously stated he could take any infant and turn them into any kind of an adult that he wanted just by using behavioral principles of rewards and rewarding certain behaviors and punishing certain behaviors. And he wasn't necessarily real popular at the time. But the idea that you can control behavior through rewards and punishment is certainly true. Ivan Pavlov, you guys have probably heard of Pavlov's dog. He actually was not a psychologist at all. He was a physiologist. He was studying digestion in dogs. And he actually discovered what we call classical conditioning, that we learn through associating or putting things together that happen together. And what he recognized was, first of all, he was studying digestion in dogs. So he would come into the room and feed the dog something and measure how much it salivated. And pretty quickly he recognized that the dog started to salivate as soon as he walked into the room. So the dog quickly put two and two together and said, Pavlov's here, I'm getting some food, and started to salivate, just like our dogs do. Our dogs know where the leash is, they know where the treats are, they know where the food is, and they know about what time of day they should be getting fed. So animals and people do put that together and put situations together. So we'll talk about classical conditioning in depth in the chapter 6 on learning. B.F. Skinner was also a radical behaviorist. He studied mice and pigeons mostly, and he believed that all of our actions are controlled by punishments and rewards. And he believed that we responded and could be controlled in exactly the same way as mice and pigeons, which wasn't necessarily a popular idea at the time, but he really did come up with some schedules of reinforcement and some really important principles of operant conditioning that are really relevant and useful today, and actually used by advertisers and apps to try to manipulate us and keep us addicted to their apps. So we will definitely talk about that in depth in the chapter 6 on learning. So there are always problems with every theory, and the problems with the behaviorist theory is, think about, have you ever done anything knowing that there's going to be negative consequences? How many of us like to speed in our car? Or how many of us, when we're late, we step on the gas a little bit more, knowing that we could get a ticket or we could get in trouble? We have a whole thought process that goes with that. We think about the consequences of being late to work. We think about the possibility of getting caught and what the consequences of getting caught are and how bad they are and all that. So the behaviors didn't take into account at all our thought processes. And so the humanistic psychologists came along after that, and they were concerned about that. And then also this idea that, we're just completely controlled by rewards and punishment. They rejected that theory. They were also critical of psychoanalysis, that we're innately bad. They really believed that we're innately good and that we also have free will. We have free choice to decide who we are and who we want to be. And they believed that people were naturally inclined, to grow and change for the better. What happened there? and they studied human strengths, virtues, and optimal behavior. So Abraham Maslow, will study him in much more depth in the chapter on motivation, came up with this idea of a hierarchy of needs. And basically what he was saying is that as human beings, we are motivated beyond near just meeting our basic needs. That once our basic needs are met, we have a need for love and belonging. We have a need to feel good about ourselves. We have a need to be respected by others. And we have a need to kind of be the best human being that we can be, and that we're always striving towards that. So Abraham Maslow had a really positive view of human nature. Carl Rogers also did, and he's also a really important contributor to counseling and to clinical psychology. And he came up with this idea of unconditional positive regard, and that we need to have unconditional positive regard for our children. And also, as counselors and therapists, we need to have unconditional positive regard for our patients or our clients. And what he was saying is that, your child may do something that you don't like or you don't approve of, but you still love that child, and that child always needs to know that you still love them no matter whatever they do and whatever you're mad about them for. And so after the humanistic psychologist, the cognitive psychologist came along and really re-emphasized the whole idea about our thought processes, and really kind of went back to Wundt's theory a little bit, and talked a lot about how do our thoughts are actually what shapes who we are, and that our thoughts are really important, and studying and paying attention to our thoughts is really important in changing our behavior and changing our emotions. They believed that our thoughts influence our behaviors and create our emotions. We are what we think. So can we increase our anxiety by how we think about things? Absolutely. Think about if you're stressed out about a test and you're telling yourself, if I fail this test, I'm never going to make it in college. I'm never going to make it in life. I'm going to be a failure. I'm going to be starving on the street. That will increase your anxiety. But if you remind yourself, I've done well in high school. I usually do pretty good on tests. I've prepared well. You can decrease your anxiety. So absolutely, how you think about things can impact how you feel about those things, and that we have control over that. And one of the things that cognitive psychologists would say is that the events themselves is not what causes you to have the emotions. It's the thoughts that you have about the events that create your feelings. So the whole goal of cognitive therapy and cognitive psychology is to really monitor your thoughts and examine your thought processes and change those distorted thoughts or those exaggerated thoughts. We tend to catastrophize sometimes, and we tend to be really hard on ourselves. And, cognitive psychology is not about being positive. It's about being real. It's about being realistic in our thoughts and rational in our thoughts. And, thinking about, is that thought helping me or is that hurting me? And what thought can I replace it with that would be better? Because it's not about pretending everything's wonderful. It's about, not making things worse, keeping things, not making things worse. Okay, so the last slide I'm going to talk about is multicultural psychology. And this is a fairly new movement in psychology, and it's because psychology kind of largely ignored culture in the past. So most of the early psychology studies were done using white male college students, probably middle class or upper middle class. And the assumption was that the information that they learned from these subjects would apply to other cultures, to other people, and women as well. They really didn't think about the fact that, maybe the information we're getting is more specific, and maybe this population that we're studying isn't necessarily representative of the whole population. But much psychological research is done in colleges and universities, because that's where professors are and where research studies are being done, and college students are usually pretty available to participate in these kinds of studies, and a lot of times they'll pay you to participate in studies as well. But the idea was that, that it would apply to everybody, and we recognized that that's not the case, especially when it came to intelligence testing and IQ testing. We will talk about that in one of the chapters, but there's a lot of negative viewpoints about IQ testing because a lot of people of other cultures didn't do as well on the IQ test because they were normed on white male students. Um, and the information and the questions that were being asked were sometimes not familiar or relevant to people from other cultures. And IQ tests have been changed and updated, and they're much more accurate, but there's still a lot of negative feelings about IQ testing. And also, IQ testing was used to try to prove that people of other cultures were inferior to other cultures. So that's another reason why there's a lot of negative emotion around IQ testing. Um, but there have been a lot of changes because of multicultural psychology in IQ testing. So, cross cultural psychology is another movement in psychology that's trying to understand cultural differences. And I want to be really clear that we are all equal. We are all of equal intelligence. You know, the things about culture and race and ethnicity really have to do with skin color and hair color and really superficial things. As human beings, we are all equal. Um, and so when we're talking about cultural differences, we're kind of talking about things like expression of emotions. Different cultures express emotions differently. If you go to an Asian culture and some Native American cultures, I don't think all Native American cultures tend to be much more reserved in their expression of emotion. And, you know, if you go in there and you're smiling really big and laughing really loud and have these, you know, talking really loud. A lot of times, people from cultures where emotions are not expressed that way will distrust you and be suspicious of you and a little uncomfortable around you. And so, it's important to really understand how cultures are different so that we can relate to those cultures better, especially now that we're in a global economy and many people work in different countries and interact with people from different countries. So that's the goal of cross-cultural psychology, not to understand that we're different, but to try to understand differences and how we can relate better to each other. So multicultural psychology is just aiming to improve the study of culture and include the culture, information about culture in psychology. We have a really popular class here on campus called Culture and Psychology. Might be called Psychology and Culture, but it's Psych 132. And one of the reasons why it's popular is it counts as 3 different types of credit: culture, global awareness, and social behavioral. So it's a class that you can take if you're interested next semester, next summer, whenever. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you in the next chapter.